When the Master of Lies ran out of believers, April 19, 1945. Joseph Goebbels sat in his Berlin bunker preparing his final radio broadcast. He was the Minister of Propaganda who had controlled German media for 12 years. His broadcasts had mesmerized millions, turned lies into believed truth, and sustained Nazi power when military reality said it should collapse. Now Berlin was surrounded. Soviet artillery shook the bunker walls. The Third Reich was dying, but Goebbels still believed his voice could change reality. He had done it before. After Stalingrad, his propaganda convinced Germans that catastrophic defeat was a strategic regrouping. After D-Day, his broadcasts reframed certain Allied victory as temporary setback. After the Ardennes offensive failed, his media machine claimed it had succeeded. Every time reality contradicted Nazi propaganda, Goebbels created alternative reality, and millions believed him, until they didn't. April 19, 1945 was different. Goebbels prepared his broadcast as Soviet troops fought in Berlin's suburbs. He would rally Germany one final time. He would convince the German people that victory was still possible. He would use the techniques that had worked for 12 years. But this time, no one was listening. Not because his broadcast didn't air, but because Allied psychological warfare had finally broken his hold on German minds. While Goebbels prepared his final lies, Allied radio stations broadcast truth. Not noble, inspiring truth. Practical, unavoidable truth. The truth that food would come if you surrendered. The truth that resistance meant death. The truth that the war was over, whether Goebbels admitted it or not. German soldiers and civilians listened to Allied broadcasts. They heard their cities named, cities that had fallen hours earlier. They heard accurate casualty numbers that matched their own experiences. They heard surrender instructions that promised safety. Then they heard Goebbels claim victory was near. The contrast was devastating. On April 19, 1945, Goebbels' propaganda machine encountered something it had never faced before. Competition that Germans believed more than they believed him. Allied psychological warfare that offered truth Germans desperately wanted to believe. Reality that even the master propagandist couldn't spin away. His broadcast aired, but the microphones might as well have been off. The German people had stopped listening. They had changed the dial. This is the story of the propaganda war's final battle, when 12 years of Nazi media control collapsed in days, when the most sophisticated propaganda apparatus in history met its match, and when Joseph Goebbels discovered that propaganda only works if people believe it. Historical context: the propaganda empires at war. Joseph Goebbels became Nazi Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda on March 13, 1933. He immediately began constructing the most comprehensive propaganda state in history. His goal was total control of all information Germans received. His method was eliminating all alternatives to Nazi messaging. His vision was a population that thought only thoughts the regime wanted them to think. Within months of taking power, Goebbels had achieved remarkable control over German information space. All radio broadcasts were placed under direct state control through the Reich Broadcasting Corporation. All newspapers were required to join the Reich press chamber and follow government editorial direction. All films required explicit propaganda ministry approval before production and distribution. All books were subject to censorship, with banned works publicly burned in May 1933. All music and art were regulated for political content through the Reich Culture Chamber. Foreign newspapers and magazines were banned or heavily censored. Publishing houses were Aryanized and brought under Nazi supervision. This control extended beyond simple censorship. Goebbels understood that propaganda required positive messaging, not just negative prohibition. He didn't just ban dissenting voices, he created compelling Nazi narratives to fill the void. The Volksempfänger, People's Receiver program, was central to Goebbels' strategy. This was a cheap radio receiver, specifically designed for propaganda purposes. The VE-301 model, named for January 30th, 1933, when Hitler took power, sold for 76 Reichsmarks. This was affordable even for working-class families, about 2 weeks' wages. The goal was ensuring every German household could receive Nazi broadcasts. By 1939, over 70% of German households owned a radio. This was the highest radio penetration rate in the world at the time. In comparison, Britain had about 60% penetration, America about 55%. Germany led the world in ensuring its population could be reached by mass media. But the Volksempfänger had deliberate technical limitations. The receivers were designed to pick up German domestic broadcasts clearly. They had limited range for international broadcasts. Foreign stations came through weak and static-filled, making listening difficult and frustrating. This technical limitation was intentional design. Goebbels wanted Germans to hear Nazi broadcasts exclusively without actually preventing international reception. If radios couldn't receive foreign broadcasts at all, it would be too obviously propaganda control. But if foreign broadcasts were available but difficult and unpleasant to listen to, most Germans wouldn't bother. As war approached, Goebbels made foreign radio listening not just difficult, but illegal. The Extraordinary Radio Measures Decree of September 1, 1939, made listening to foreign broadcasts a serious crime. First offence could bring years in prison. Repeat offenders, or those who spread information from foreign broadcasts, faced execution. Thousands were prosecuted under these laws. Dozens were executed for the crime of listening to BBC. This combination of technical limitation and legal prohibition created effective information control. Most Germans heard only what Goebbels wanted them to hear. Those curious enough and brave enough to listen to foreign broadcasts risked their lives. The system worked brilliantly in the 1930s and early war years. Germans heard repeated messages about Nazi successes, Jewish conspiracies, and Germanic racial superiority. They believed Germany was winning every battle because all available information said so. They dismissed Allied claims as propaganda because German media told them it was lies and they had no easy way to verify. Goebbels understood propaganda psychology with remarkable sophistication. He had studied crowd psychology, advertising techniques, and mass communication theory. He understood that repetition created belief even for dubious claims. He knew that controlling all information sources prevented formation of contrary narratives. He knew that emotional appeals overwhelmed rational analysis in most people. He knew that people believed what they wanted to believe if given permission. His techniques were remarkably sophisticated for the 1930s-1940s era. Use simple, repeated slogans that embedded in memory through constant repetition. Frame all events in ideological terms that supported Nazi worldview. Attribute successes to the system and the Führer, failures to external enemies and internal traitors. Create emotional connection between Nazi symbols and German national identity. Never admit errors or defeats. Always reframe setbacks as strategic choices or temporary situations. Use multiple media reinforcing the same message. Radio, newspapers, films, posters, all saying the same things. Appeal to Germans' desire for order, strength, and national pride. Present complex situations in simple, binary terms. Us versus them. Civilization versus barbarism. These methods worked because Germans had no practical access to contradictory information. If every information source says the same thing repeatedly, most people eventually believe it. Critical thinking requires comparing different sources and perspectives. Goebbels systematically eliminated the ability to make comparisons. The effectiveness was demonstrated repeatedly. After the Röhm Purge in 1934, Goebbels convinced Germans it was necessary to prevent a coup. After Kristallnacht in 1938, he framed Jewish suffering as justified response to Jewish aggression. After invading Poland in 1939, he convinced Germans that Poland had attacked first. After Stalingrad in 1943, he reframed catastrophic defeat as strategic regrouping. Each time, Germans believed the official narrative because they had no access to alternatives. But Goebbels faced an enemy he ultimately couldn't control: Allied psychological warfare capabilities. Britain and America developed their own sophisticated propaganda operations. They couldn't easily reach Germans at first. German technical limitations and legal prohibitions made Allied broadcasting difficult, but as the war progressed, Allied capabilities improved dramatically while German defences degraded. Britain's Political Warfare Executive, PWE, was established in 1941 to coordinate psychological operations. It brought together military intelligence, diplomacy, and broadcasting expertise. Its mission was undermining enemy morale while strengthening Allied and neutral support. The BBC European Service broadcast to occupied Europe and Germany in multiple languages. BBC broadcasts were clearly identified as coming from London. This white propaganda approach built credibility through transparency. The BBC reported news with reasonable accuracy, including Allied setbacks. This honesty created trust that obvious propaganda couldn't achieve. The American Office of War Information, OWI, developed sophisticated propaganda after Pearl Harbor. OWI brought American advertising and Hollywood expertise to psychological warfare. They understood mass persuasion techniques from commercial contexts. They applied these to political and military messaging. Radio Luxembourg, captured by Allied forces in September 1944, became a powerful Allied broadcasting centre. Its transmitters could reach deep into Germany with strong, clear signals. The station broadcast music, news, and psychological warfare content. It competed directly with German radio on technical terms and won. These organizations learned from Goebbels' successes while avoiding his critical mistakes. Nazi propaganda was heavy-handed and obvious. Germans knew they were being propagandized even if they believed the messages. Allied propaganda was often subtle and disguised. Germans didn't always recognize they were consuming Allied psychological warfare. The critical Allied innovation was distinguishing between white and black propaganda. White propaganda was openly identified as Allied messaging. BBC broadcasts clearly stated, "This is London calling" before programmes. They reported news with reasonable accuracy and acknowledged Allied setbacks. They built credibility over months and years by being truthful about verifiable facts. Germans listening knew it was Allied propaganda, but trusted it because it was accurate. Black propaganda pretended to be from German sources or neutral parties. Fake German radio stations broadcast with perfect native accents and cultural knowledge. They claimed to be Wehrmacht officers, Nazi officials, or patriotic German citizens. They spread rumours, demoralization, and doubt disguised as insider German perspectives. Germans listening believed they were hearing authentic German voices sharing hidden truths. The most successful black propaganda station was Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Radio Calais. It operated from 1943-1945, claiming to be a Wehrmacht forces radio station. It played popular German military music and included what seemed like genuine military announcements. but it interspersed subtle demoralization messages and accurate reports of German defeats. Soldatensender Calais was brilliant psychological warfare. It would play popular German songs that soldiers requested in letters, creating appearance of authenticity. Then a news bulletin would report accurate information about German losses that official channels suppressed. The bulletin would use perfect military jargon, formats, and insider knowledge. It sounded more authentically military than Goebbels' civilian propaganda ministry broadcasts. German soldiers listened to Soldatensender Calais in huge numbers across all fronts. They believed it was a genuine German military station providing uncensored information. They trusted its reports more than official propaganda because it seemed like insider truth. The Gestapo investigated repeatedly, trying to find the traitors broadcasting from Calais. They never found them because the broadcasters were British psychological warfare specialists in Milton Bryan, England. The operation was run by Sefton Delmer, a British journalist who spoke flawless German. Delmer had lived in Berlin before the war and understood German culture intimately. He recruited German prisoners, deserters, and émigrés who could provide authentic voices and knowledge. The programming was sophisticated enough that even German intelligence experts believed it was genuine. Another black propaganda success was Gustav Siegfried I's GS1 station. It claimed to be run by conservative German patriots opposed to Nazi corruption rather than opposing Germany itself. It attacked Nazi officials for personal immorality, corruption, and incompetence. It used nationalist rhetoric that resonated with traditional conservative Germans who disliked Nazi radicalism. It suggested that removing corrupt Nazi leaders would restore proper German values. GS1 was particularly effective because it attacked Nazis from the nationalist right rather than the left. Many Germans dismissed left-wing or foreign criticism as enemy propaganda, but criticism framed as patriotic German concern seemed more credible. GS1 exploited divisions within German society that Goebbels tried to suppress. These black propaganda stations were devastating because they bypassed Germans' psychological defences. Germans expected BBC broadcasts to be Allied propaganda and listened sceptically, if at all. They had been trained to recognise and dismiss obvious Allied messaging. But Soldatensender Calais and Gustav Siegfried I's seemed to be German voices. Germans listening believed they were hearing fellow Germans telling suppressed truths. The psychological impact was far greater than obvious Allied broadcasts could achieve. It created the impression that even Germans themselves knew the official narrative was false. Allied psychological warfare also used leaflets dropped over German territory. Millions of leaflets were dropped from 1942-1945. Early leaflets were crude and ineffective. Later leaflets were sophisticated psychological operations. Effective leaflets included safe conduct, passes promising good treatment to those who surrendered, accurate information about battles and casualties that contradicted German propaganda, photos showing well-treated German prisoners of war, lists of German units that had surrendered, proving resistance was futile, instructions on how to surrender safely to avoid being shot by retreating SS units. The safe conduct passes were particularly effective. They were wallet-sized cards in German. They promised that soldiers carrying them would be well treated if they surrendered. They were signed by Allied commanders. Eisenhower's signature appeared on millions. German soldiers kept these passes despite regulations forbidding it. They were found on captured and killed German soldiers throughout late 1944-1945. Their widespread presence indicated that German soldiers believed Allied promises more than Goebbels' claims about Allied brutality. Allied psychological warfare benefited from transmitter power improvements. Early in the war, Allied broadcasts were weak and difficult to receive in Germany. Static and signal strength made listening frustrating. By 1944, Allies controlled powerful transmitters. The Aspidistra transmitter in Britain was the most powerful in the world, 600 kilowatts. It could override German broadcasts on the same frequency. Luxembourg transmitters were captured intact and used for Allied broadcasts. Mobile transmitters followed Allied armies, broadcasting to nearby German units. The Aspidistra transmitter could literally shout down German radio. When Goebbels broadcast, Aspidistra could broadcast on the same frequency with more power. German radios would receive the Allied broadcast instead. Goebbels' carefully crafted messages were drowned out by Allied truth. By early 1945, the propaganda balance had shifted decisively. Millions of Germans listened to Allied broadcasts, despite the death penalty for doing so. They believed Allied reports more than German official statements. They used BBC time signals to verify when Allied broadcasts were truthful about military developments. The Allied psychological warfare strategy for Endgame was carefully planned. Accelerate the collapse of German morale. Make surrender psychologically acceptable. Prevent fanatical last-stand resistance. Reduce Allied casualties by making Germans quit rather than fight. Undermine any attempt by Nazi leadership to rally continued resistance. This strategy required defeating Goebbels' propaganda at the moment he most needed it to work. When Germany was collapsing, Goebbels needed Germans to believe resistance was still worthwhile. Allied psychological warfare needed Germans to believe surrender was the only rational choice. The propaganda battle of April 1945 would determine which narrative Germans accepted. Would they believe Goebbels' promises of miracle weapons and imminent victory, or would they believe Allied broadcasts saying the war was over? Their choice would determine how many more people died before Germany surrendered. Technical analysis: the machinery of mass persuasion. Radio broadcasting technology was the primary battlefield for psychological warfare. Understanding the technical capabilities and limitations explains how the propaganda war was won. Goebbels' radio system in 1945 faced severe technical problems. Allied bombing had destroyed many German transmitter stations. Power supply was unreliable due to infrastructure damage. Many transmitters were off the air or operating at reduced power. The German radio network in April 1945, Berlin transmitters were damaged but still operational. Hamburg transmitters had limited range due to power shortages. Munich transmitters worked intermittently. Many regional transmitters were destroyed or in Allied-controlled territory. The remaining German transmitters could reach German territory, but signal quality was poor in many areas. Static interference from damaged electrical infrastructure made reception difficult. Germans listening to German broadcasts often heard only partial, garbled audio. Allied transmitters in April 1945 had overwhelming technical superiority. The Aspidistra transmitter alone could cover all of Germany. Multiple transmitters provided redundancy. If Germans jammed one, others were available. Signal quality was far superior to damaged German transmitters. The Aspidistra transmitter specifications were impressive even by modern standards. 600 kilowatts of power, 10 times more powerful than most commercial stations. Medium wave frequency that propagated well across Europe. Directional antenna that focused signal toward Germany. The ability to override weaker transmitters on the same frequency. When Aspidistra broadcast, it could be heard clearly across Germany. When Goebbels broadcast on German transmitters, Aspidistra could jam the signal or override it entirely. This technical superiority was decisive. Allied psychological warfare units understood radio propagation physics. They knew that medium-wave radio bounced off the ionosphere at night. This extended range dramatically after dark. Allied broadcasts scheduled key programming for evening hours when German workers and soldiers could listen. They also understood that multiple transmitters on slightly different frequencies prevented jamming. If Germany tried to jam one frequency, Allied broadcasts continued on others. German listeners could always find an Allied station. Content creation was equally sophisticated. Allied psychological warfare employed native German speakers who understood German culture, dialects, and psychology. Many were German emigrants who had fled Nazi persecution. They knew how Germans thought and what arguments would resonate. Sefton Delmer, head of British black propaganda operations, was particularly skilled. He spoke perfect German and understood German psychology intimately. He created content that sounded more genuinely German than Goebbels' propaganda. Delmer's broadcasts included military jargon and slang that only real soldiers would use, regional accents that matched the target audience, inside jokes and cultural references that proved the broadcasters knew Germany intimately, information that could be independently verified, building credibility. The verification strategy was critical. Allied broadcasts would report an event, say, the fall of a specific city. German soldiers near that city would know the report was accurate. This built trust that other Allied claims were also truthful. Then Allied broadcasts would make claims about other battles. Germans who had confirmed earlier accuracy would believe these new claims. Over time, Allied broadcasts became more trusted than German official sources. Leaflet production and distribution was equally sophisticated. By 1945, Allied forces were producing millions of leaflets weekly. These weren't crude propaganda posters. They were carefully designed psychological operations tools. Effective leaflet design principles included use German typography and design conventions, include verifiable information that Germans could confirm, provide actionable instructions how to surrender safely, address specific German concerns, fear of Soviet treatment, worry about families, include testimonials from German POWs who were being well treated. The safe conduct passes were particularly well designed. They were wallet-sized for easy concealment. They used simple, clear language. They included Eisenhower's signature for authority. They promised specific protections under Geneva Convention. German soldiers carried these passes despite knowing the penalty for possession was severe. This indicated they trusted Allied promises more than they feared German military police. Distribution methods were also sophisticated. Artillery shells designed to burst at altitude and scatter leaflets. Aircraft bombing missions that included leaflet drops along with explosives. Tactical leaflet drops targeting specific German units before attacks. Leaflets attached to balloons that drifted across lines. The scale of leaflet operations was enormous. By war's end, over 6 billion leaflets had been dropped on Axis territory. Early leaflets in 1942-1943 were often crude and ineffective, dismissed by German soldiers and civilians. Later leaflets in 1944-1945 were sophisticated psychological operations tools backed by research and testing. The evolution of leaflet effectiveness demonstrates Allied learning process. Early leaflets made mistakes, obvious propaganda tone, unverifiable claims, poor German psychology understanding, low-quality printing. Later leaflets corrected these errors. Neutral, factual tone, verifiable claims, deep German psychology understanding, high-quality printing. Effective leaflet categories served specific psychological warfare purposes. Safe conduct passes were wallet-sized cards promising good treatment to those who surrendered. They used simple, clear language without propaganda rhetoric. They included Eisenhower's signature lending authority. They promised specific Geneva Convention protections. They provided practical instructions on how to surrender safely without being shot. The design was carefully considered, wallet-sized for easy concealment in pockets, durable paper stock that wouldn't disintegrate, clear German without complex vocabulary, official-looking format with seals and signatures, no obvious Allied imagery making possession too dangerous. German soldiers carried these despite severe penalties for possessing enemy propaganda. They were found on captured and killed German soldiers throughout late 1944-1945. Their widespread presence indicated Germans trusted Allied promises more than they feared German military police. Information leaflets provided accurate news, contradicting German propaganda. They reported specific battles and actual outcomes. They listed destroyed or captured German units with accurate details. They named cities and dates of Allied advances before German media admitted losses. They provided more honest casualty figures than German official numbers. The power came from verification. A soldier would receive a leaflet claiming his neighbouring division had been destroyed. He would hear nothing from official sources. But soldiers from that division wouldn't appear. Supplies would be redirected. Officers would quietly admit the division was unavailable. The leaflet was proven accurate through the soldier's own observations. This built trust that other Allied claims were also accurate. Surrender instruction leaflets provided practical, detailed guidance on surrendering safely. This addressed major German concerns about how to surrender without being killed. German soldiers feared being shot during surrender, by Allies who thought it was a trick, or by German officers who considered it treason. These leaflets provided step-by-step instructions. Approach Allied lines at night or during lulls when safe. Carry white cloth or leaflet clearly visible. Keep hands raised and visible at all times. Leave weapons behind before approaching. Call out in German that you wish to surrender. Follow all Allied instructions immediately. Expect to be searched and have hands bound temporarily. You will receive food and water shortly after processing. You will be transferred to POW camps within days. This practical detail was psychologically powerful. It made surrender seem achievable rather than abstract. It addressed specific fears about the surrender process. Family-focused leaflets appealed to soldiers' concerns about loved ones. They emphasized that continued fighting endangered families. They pointed out Germany was being destroyed by continued resistance. They argued surrendering quickly would end the war sooner, protecting German civilians. One effective leaflet showed destroyed German city with caption identifying it. Text: "While you fight here, your city burns. End the war. Save what can still be saved." This bypassed abstract patriotism and appealed to immediate family loyalty. Testimonial leaflets included statements from German POWs describing good treatment. Photos showed German POWs receiving meals, medical care, decent accommodations. Quotes included soldiers' names, units, hometowns, information Germans could potentially verify. Some included messages from specific POWs to families in particular cities. These were powerful because they seemed like insider information from German soldiers describing their own experiences. Distribution timing was coordinated with military operations. Warnings dropped hours before attacks, offering last chance to surrender. After successful attacks, leaflets offered surrender to surrounded units. Between operations, leaflets sustained psychological pressure. One effective technique was sequential leaflet campaigns. Day 1, leaflet warns of upcoming attack, names German units present. Day 2, attack occurs exactly as predicted, demonstrating Allied intelligence. Day 3, leaflet lists Allied advances and German casualties from attack. Day 4, Leaflet offers surrender to surrounded units with safe conduct pass. Day 5. Leaflet lists units that have already surrendered successfully. This demonstrated Allied accuracy, intelligence capabilities, and trustworthiness. Quality control and testing improved effectiveness systematically. Allied units interviewed German POWs about what would persuade them. They tested different designs and messages on POW focus groups. They analyzed which leaflets soldiers kept. They refined messaging based on feedback and effectiveness data. This evidence-based approach was unusual for the era. It gave them significant advantages over German propaganda based on ideological assumptions. One innovative technique was the front post leaflets. These were designed to look like German military newspapers. They included the same layout, typography, and format as genuine German publications. But the content was Allied psychological warfare. German soldiers would find front post and think it was a genuine German newspaper. They would read it and absorb the content before realizing it was Allied propaganda, even after realizing the information had already influenced them. Audio recording technology enabled another psychological warfare technique. Allied forces recorded German prisoners of war. The recordings were then broadcast on radio stations. Germans listening would hear familiar accents and voices. The recordings included German POWs describing good treatment, German officers urging surrender to save lives, messages from German soldiers to families in specific cities, testimony about Allied military strength. These were more credible than Allied announcers because they were obviously German voices. Families hearing messages from captured soldiers knew the broadcasts were real. This created trust in other Allied claims. Timing and coordination of psychological warfare was carefully planned. Allied military operations and psychological operations worked together. A typical coordinated operation. Day 1. Leaflets dropped warning of upcoming attack, urging evacuation or surrender. Day 2. Artillery bombardment begins, with shells including more leaflets. Day 3. Attack commences, with radio broadcasts describing the attack accurately. Day 4. Broadcasts report Allied victory, if applicable, before German news does. Day 5. Leaflets and broadcasts urge surrender of isolated German units. This coordination demonstrated Allied military effectiveness. Germans saw that Allied broadcasts were accurate about military developments. If Allies said they had captured a position, they had captured it. If Goebbels said Germans still held it, he was lying. The cumulative effect was credibility differential. Allied sources became more credible than German official sources. This credibility gap determined which message Germans believed. By April 1945, this credibility gap was enormous. Germans knew Goebbels lied constantly. They knew Allied broadcasts were usually accurate. When both presented conflicting information, Germans believed the Allies. The technical sophistication of Allied psychological warfare in April 1945 was remarkable. Superior radio transmitter power and coverage, better signal quality due to intact infrastructure, professional content creation by native speakers, coordination with military operations for accuracy, multiple reinforcing media, radio, leaflets, recordings, verification opportunities that built trust. Against this sophisticated operation, Goebbels had damaged transmitters with unreliable power, repeated lies that had destroyed his credibility, audiences who actively sought alternative information, no ability to prevent Germans from listening to Allied broadcasts. The technical superiority alone would have given Allies an advantage. Combined with credibility differential, it was decisive. Human impact. The Germans who changed the dial. Margarete Schwarz, was a 34-year-old housewife in Stuttgart in April 1945. Her husband was fighting on the Eastern Front. She had 2 children and elderly parents to care for. She listened to German radio every evening for news. By April 1945, she was listening to BBC instead. This was punishable by death if discovered. Her neighbours reported people for listening to foreign broadcasts, but Margarete risked it because German radio told her nothing useful. Goebbels would say we were winning, she recalled in a 1970s interview. But I could see the ruins from Allied bombing. I could see the refugees flooding west from the Russian advance. I knew we were losing. The BBC told me the truth. It told me which cities were falling, how far the Allies had advanced. I needed that information to protect my family. On April 19, 1945, Margarete listened to both broadcasts. Goebbels claimed victory was near, that secret weapons would turn the tide. BBC reported that Soviet forces were fighting in Berlin's outskirts. BBC listed German cities that had fallen that day. One of those cities was her husband's last known location. Goebbels didn't mention that city falling. German radio said nothing about Soviet advances. I knew then that my husband was probably dead or captured, Margarete said. Goebbels lied even about things I needed desperately to know. The BBC told me the truth even when it was terrible. I trusted them because they didn't lie to make me feel better. Margarete survived the war. Her husband died in Soviet captivity in 1946. She always credited BBC broadcasts with helping her make decisions that saved her children's lives. Obergefreiter Hans Keller was a 22-year-old Wehrmacht soldier near the Elbe River in April 1945. His unit was surrounded, cut off from supplies. Officers told them to fight to the death. Goebbels' broadcasts said relief was coming. Keller's unit had a radio. They listened to Soldatensender Calais when officers weren't present. The broadcasts told them that no relief was coming, that their officers were lying, that surrender to Americans was safe. Keller kept a safe conduct pass he had found in a leaflet. He had hidden it for weeks despite the risk. On April 20, 1945, he surrendered to American forces. He handed them the safe conduct pass. They treated him exactly as promised. I believed Allied propaganda more than I believed my own officers, Keller said in an interview years later. Goebbels had lied so many times. When Allied leaflets said we would be fed and treated well if we surrendered, I believed them. They had been truthful about everything else. Goebbels had been lying about everything. Keller survived the war as a POW. He returned to Germany in 1947. He kept the safe conduct pass for the rest of his life. Anna Fischer was a 19-year-old radio operator for German military intelligence in April 1945. Her job was monitoring Allied broadcasts and summarizing them for commanders. She listened to BBC, American broadcasts, and black propaganda stations for hours daily. I knew Soldatensender Calais was Allied propaganda, Fischer recalled. We had reports identifying it as British black propaganda, but it was more accurate than our own intelligence reports. It reported German losses before our own military admitted them. I would hear about a division being destroyed on Soldatensender Calais. Then 3 days later, our intelligence would confirm it. Fischer began including information from Allied broadcasts in her reports. She didn't identify the source as Allied propaganda. She presented it as intelligence gathered from monitoring communications. German commanders made decisions based on Allied propaganda she had laundered as legitimate intelligence. I was committing treason technically, Fischer said, but I was providing more accurate information than official sources. I rationalized that I was helping German commanders make better decisions based on reality rather than Goebbels' fantasies. On April 19, 1945, Fischer listened to Goebbels' broadcast. She also listened to BBC broadcasting at the same time. The contradiction was complete. Goebbels said victory was near. BBC described Soviet troops blocks from the bunker where Goebbels was broadcasting. Goebbels said German forces were counter-attacking successfully. BBC listed 20 German cities that had fallen that week. I filed a report based on BBC information. My commander surrendered his unit 2 days later based partially on my report. Fisher emigrated to America after the war. She worked as a translator at war crimes trials. She never regretted betraying Goebbels' propaganda for Allied truth. These personal stories reveal the human reality of the propaganda war. Germans weren't mindless believers of Goebbels. They were people trying to survive and protect their families. They believed sources that helped them navigate reality. By April 1945, that source was Allied propaganda, not German. Strategic impact. When the propaganda machine failed. The strategic impact of propaganda collapse can be measured in German military behavior in April 1945. German resistance varied dramatically depending on whether units believed Goebbels or Allied broadcasts. Units that believed Goebbels' claims fought fanatically. SS divisions and Hitler Youth units resisted even when surrounded. They expected relief that never came. They believed miracle weapons would change the war. They died defending positions that had no strategic value. Units that believed Allied broadcasts surrendered when resistance became futile. Wehrmacht divisions in Western Germany surrendered to American forces in large numbers. Officers negotiated surrenders to spare their men. They accepted that the war was lost, and further resistance meant pointless death. The surrender rates tell the story. In early April 1945, approximately 10,000 German soldiers surrendered daily to Western Allies. By late April 1945, this had increased to over 50,000 daily. These weren't all combat defeats. Many were voluntary surrenders by intact units. Compared to the Eastern Front, where Goebbels' propaganda about Soviet atrocities was believed, resistance remained fierce. German soldiers fighting Soviets believed they were fighting for survival. Goebbels' claims about Soviet brutality were largely true. This propaganda remained effective because it matched German soldiers' experiences and fears. But in the West, Goebbels' claims about Allied brutality were obviously false. German soldiers who surrendered were well treated. This validated Allied propaganda and discredited Goebbels. Word spread through German units that American captivity was safe. The differential surrender rates were strategically significant. Western Allied forces advanced rapidly because German resistance was collapsing. Soviet forces advanced more slowly because German resistance remained stronger. The difference was substantially due to propaganda effectiveness. German civilian behavior also showed propaganda collapse. Cities that believed Goebbels' broadcasts attempted to defend against Allied forces. This resulted in destructive urban battles and civilian casualties. Cities where civilians believed Allied broadcasts often pressured military commanders to surrender. Civilians recognized that defense was futile and would only destroy their city. They wanted to preserve what could be preserved. Heidelberg was preserved largely intact because city leaders surrendered to Americans. They believed Allied promises that the city would be spared if undefended. They refused to follow Goebbels' orders to defend to the last. The city survived while others were devastated. The propaganda battle also affected Nazi leadership decision-making. Hitler and Goebbels believed their own propaganda to some extent. They thought German morale remained strong. They expected civilians and soldiers to fight fanatically until victory. This delusion influenced their decisions. They refused to surrender even when surrender could have saved lives. They ordered defenses of indefensible positions. They expected popular uprisings against Allied occupation that never materialized. The failure of propaganda affected the July 20th, 1944, assassination attempts aftermath differently than expected. After the failed bomb plot against Hitler, Goebbels mounted a massive propaganda campaign. He portrayed the plotters as traitors. He rallied Germans around Hitler. The campaign worked in July 1944. Germans largely supported continued loyalty to Hitler. Goebbels successfully framed the plotters as villains. But by April 1945, similar propaganda attempts failed completely. Goebbels tried to portray Germans who advocated surrender as traitors. He demanded continued resistance. Germans ignored him. The difference was credibility. In July 1944, Germans still believed German official sources. By April 1945, they didn't. Goebbels' final broadcasts showed increasing desperation. April 19th broadcast claimed victory was near. April 20th broadcast, Hitler's birthday, praised the Führer and predicted triumph. April 22nd broadcast admitted setbacks, but promised they were temporary. Each broadcast was less credible than the last. Germans listening could hear the desperation. They compared Goebbels' claims to reality they could see and Allied reports they trusted. The contrast discredited Goebbels utterly. Allied psychological warfare units monitored German morale through various sources. Captured German soldiers were interviewed about what they believed. Intercepted mail revealed German civilian attitudes. Intelligence agents in neutral countries reported on German refugee testimony. Analysis of German resistance patterns indicated whether units still believed propaganda. These sources showed consistent pattern. German belief in Nazi propaganda collapsed dramatically in April 1945. Allied propaganda became more influential than German official sources. Germans made decisions based on Allied claims rather than Goebbels' claims. The strategic result was shortened war. If Germans had believed Goebbels and fought fanatically everywhere, Allied casualties would have been much higher. The war might have lasted weeks or months longer. Hundreds of thousands more people would have died. The strategic result was shortened war and reduced casualties. If Germans had believed Goebbels and fought fanatically everywhere, Allied casualties would have been dramatically higher. The war might have lasted weeks or months longer, with hundreds of thousands more deaths. Instead, German resistance collapsed more rapidly in the West than military factors alone would explain. Specific measurable impacts included surrender rates in Western Germany that exceeded combat defeat rates, entire intact German units surrendering rather than defending to destruction, German civilians pressuring military commanders to surrender cities rather than defend them, reduced Allied casualties during the final offensive compared to earlier operations, faster Allied advance through Germany than planning estimates predicted. Allied psychological warfare operations may have saved more lives than any single military campaign. The exact number is impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands of Allied soldiers survived because Germans chose to surrender rather than fight to the death. German civilian casualties were also reduced by cities surrendering rather than being destroyed in urban combat. The psychological warfare success also had important post-war implications. Germans who had stopped believing Nazi propaganda before war's end were more receptive to democratic re-education. They had already mentally separated from Nazi ideology during the war. They were ready to accept new political systems and values. This made Allied occupation and reconstruction significantly easier. Germans who had believed Nazi propaganda until the bitter end struggled more psychologically with defeat. They had invested years of belief in Nazi claims and promises. Admitting they had been systematically lied to for 12 years was psychologically devastating. Some never fully accepted German responsibility for the war and its atrocities. The differential in post-war adjustment correlated strongly with when Germans had stopped believing Nazi propaganda. Those who had turned to Allied broadcasts in 1944-1945 adjusted more quickly. Those who had believed Goebbels until the end often remained embittered and resentful. This pattern influenced how different regions and demographics processed German history and reconstruction. Modern relevance: information warfare in the digital age. The Goebbels Allied propaganda war offers enduring lessons for modern information warfare. The fundamental dynamics remain relevant despite massive technological changes. The psychology of persuasion, credibility building, and narrative competition hasn't changed, even though the tools have evolved dramatically. Goebbels' propaganda system resembled modern authoritarian information control in structure and methods. Control all domestic media sources to prevent alternative narratives. Make alternative information difficult or dangerous to access. Criminalize consumption of foreign or opposition information. Use constant repetition to embed preferred narratives in population consciousness. Never admit errors or defeats publicly. Always reframe setbacks as temporary or strategic. Create emotional rather than rational connections to ideology. Present simple narratives that confirm existing prejudices and desires. North Korea's information system operates on essentially these same principles today. China's Great Firewall and media control attempts similar total information dominance. Russia's media landscape under Putin follows comparable patterns of state narrative control. These modern authoritarian information systems are Goebbels' model adapted to digital technology. These systems work effectively when populations have severely limited access to alternatives. They begin failing when populations can regularly access contradictory information from credible sources. The transition from effective control to credibility crisis can happen remarkably quickly once started. The Allied breakthrough strategy remains directly relevant to modern information operations. Provide accurate, verifiable information that target audiences can confirm through personal observation. Build credibility over extended time through consistency and honesty about verifiable facts. Exploit gaps and contradictions in authoritarian narratives systematically. Provide practical information people desperately need for daily survival and decision-making. Make continued belief in authoritarian narratives psychologically costly by highlighting contradictions with observable reality. Modern democratic information operations face challenges allies didn't face. Information environment is far more complex. Social media allows instant contradiction of claims. Verification is easier, but so is creating false verification. But basic principles remain. Credibility is earned through accuracy. Propaganda that contradicts observable reality fails eventually. People believe sources that help them navigate their world. Emotional appeals work short-term, but accuracy works long-term. Russia's information operations in Ukraine demonstrate both lessons. Early Russian propaganda claimed quick victory. When this didn't happen, credibility collapsed. Russians increasingly believed Ukrainian and Western sources over official Russian media. This pattern mirrors April 1945 Germany. Government propaganda claiming victory while people observed defeat. Alternative information sources providing more accurate assessments. Population shifting trust from official sources to alternatives. Social media accelerates these dynamics. Goebbels had weeks or months before contradictions became undeniable. Modern propagandists have hours or days. Claims are fact-checked instantly by global networks, but social media also enables new propaganda techniques. Flooding zones with contradictory information, making it impossible to distinguish truth from lies. Exhausting populations so they stop trying to determine truth. This fire hose of falsehood technique differs from Goebbels' approach. Goebbels wanted Germans to believe specific false narratives. Modern information warfare sometimes just wants confusion and paralysis. The Allied counter-strategy remains valuable. Consistent, verifiable truth eventually cuts through confusion. Practical information people need creates trust. Demonstrable accuracy builds credibility that emotional appeals can't match. Democratic societies face unique challenges. Goebbels controlled all German information sources. Democratic governments can't and shouldn't control information, but this means hostile propaganda can reach populations freely. The defense isn't control, but resilience. Educated populations that think critically. Multiple information sources that fact-check each other. Media literacy that helps people evaluate claims. Democratic institutions that build trust through transparency. These defenses require investment and commitment. They're less immediate than censorship, but they're more robust long-term. The Goebbels Allied propaganda war showed that truth eventually wins, but eventually can be 12 years. The question is shortening that timeline. Modern information operations should study Allied psychological warfare. Accuracy builds credibility that enables influence. Understanding target psychology enables effective messaging. Multiple reinforcing channels are more effective than single sources. Coordination with reality is essential. Claims must match observable truth. Patience is required. Credibility builds over time. Conclusion: the broadcast. No one heard April 19, 1945, Joseph Goebbels broadcast to Germany. His voice, practiced and persuasive, promised victory. Secret weapons would arrive. Heroic resistance would turn the tide. Germany would triumph. But no one believed him. German soldiers listened to Allied broadcasts instead. German civilians tuned to BBC or Radio Luxembourg. Even German officials privately admitted Goebbels was lying. The master propagandist had run out of believers. For 12 years, Goebbels had controlled what Germans thought. He had turned lies into accepted truth, through repetition and control. He had maintained Nazi power when reality said it should collapse. He had convinced millions to believe the unbelievable, but propaganda only works if people believe it. And by April 1945, Germans had stopped believing. They believed Allied broadcasts instead. Not because Allied broadcasts were noble or inspiring, but because they were true, because they helped Germans understand their world, because they proved accurate repeatedly. The credibility gap between Goebbels and Allied psychological warfare had become unbridgeable. Every Goebbels claim was contradicted by reality. Every Allied claim was verified by experience. Germans chose to believe sources that told them truth. Goebbels' final broadcasts were exercises in futility. He spoke into microphones. The transmissions reached German radios, but the audience had changed the dial. 10 days after his April 19th broadcast, Goebbels was dead. He killed his children and then himself in Hitler's bunker. His last acts were as committed to delusion as his propaganda. He believed until the end that Germans would rally. They didn't. They surrendered. They accepted defeat. They chose survival over Goebbels' heroic resistance fantasy. Allied psychological warfare had achieved its goal, not through noble truth-telling alone, but through systematic credibility building. through accurate reporting that could be verified, through practical information that helped people survive. The propaganda war's lessons endure. Control of information requires preventing access to alternatives. Credibility is earned through accuracy over time. Propaganda that contradicts observable reality eventually fails. People believe sources that help them navigate their world. Truth is more powerful than lies, eventually. Goebbels was a master propagandist. His techniques were sophisticated and effective. He controlled German minds for 12 years, but he lost the propaganda war, not because Allies had better transmitters, though they did, not because Allies had better writers, though they did, but because Allies told truth that could be verified, and Goebbels told lies that Germans could see through. The day Goebbels lost wasn't a single day. It was a process of credibility erosion over months and years. But April 19, 1945, crystallized the collapse, the day when his broadcast meant nothing, when his voice couldn't move anyone, when the master of propaganda had no audience. Germans listened to Allied broadcasts instead. They believed Allied promises of safety. They accepted Allied assessments of the war. They rejected Goebbels' final appeals. The propaganda machine that had sustained Nazi power had finally failed, not because it stopped broadcasting, but because it stopped being believed. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, who controlled German minds for 12 years, defeated by Allied psychological warfare that offered truth he couldn't match. His last broadcast aired, but no one heard it who still believed. The microphones were on. The transmitters were working. The voice was persuasive as always, but the audience was gone. They had changed the dial to stations that told them truth, to broadcasts that helped them survive, to sources they trusted, away from Goebbels, forever. The day Allied propaganda defeated Goebbels' last broadcast, not by drowning it out, but by making it irrelevant. The master propagandist spoke. No one listened. The war was over. Even if Goebbels didn't admit it, the Germans knew, because Allied broadcasts had told them, and they believed. The propaganda war was over. Truth had won. Eventually, finally, decisively.